In tonight's news edition, His Majesty the King heads for an Arab summit in Qatar after holding talks with Bahrain's monarch. The King says in an interview that pan-Arab cooperation needs to be bolstered to face challenges facing the Arab and Muslim worlds. And the Prime Minister-designate briefs the Senate on his attempt to form a cabinet and the government's course of action. Good evening and welcome to a new edition of the news, and here are the details. His Majesty the King heads for the Qatari capital, Doha, for the opening tomorrow of an Arab summit. The King last night held talks in Manama with Bahrain's monarch, Hamad bin Isa Al Khalifa, during which they expressed their common interest in cementing cooperation between Jordan and the Gulf Arab Kingdom. The two leaders also discussed the escalating Syrian crisis and its fallout on the region, calling for a political solution to end the suffering of Syrian people and maintains the country's unity and cohesion. King Abdullah briefed the Bahraini monarch on his talks this weekend with US President Barack Obama in Amman, which tackled the serious situation in Syria and efforts to kickstart Palestinian-Israeli peace talks based on the two-state solution. In an interview with the Qatari Al-Sharq newspaper, King Abdullah said joint Arab action should be bolstered to address the extraordinary and unprecedented challenges facing the Arab and Muslim worlds. He said concerted and coordinated efforts are needed to minimize the negative repercussions of the challenges on the nation's strategic interests and major causes. The King stressed hope that tomorrow's summit in Doha will be a turning point and help to develop an Arab strategy to address challenges. King Abdullah said Jordan and Qatar maintain deep ties and said Amman is interested in further cementing cooperation with the Gulf Arab state. On Jordan's reforms, the King said the process is boundless and will go ahead despite challenges and tough conditions in the country. The ultimate goal of reform, the King stressed, is to reinvigorate democracy and enhance public participation in the decision-making process. On Syria, the King emphasized a peaceful political transition to safeguard the country's unity and sovereignty and stop it sliding into more chaos. He said the conflict had a serious impact on Syria's neighbors, as Jordan is home to about 500,000 Syrian refugees, and the number could double before the year's end. His Majesty also said finding a solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict is the key to solving other problems in the Middle East. He warned that the region would otherwise remain prone to more tension and instability and could be dragged into a dark tunnel. He said injustice, a peace process in limbo, and loss of hope are the major drivers of violence. He also said failure to solve the conflict could lead to an arms race at the expense of development. Arab support for the Syrian people will be high on the agenda when the Arab summit opens in Qatar tomorrow. Other key topics to be tackled by Arab monarchs and heads of state during the two-day summit are the Palestinian issue and upgrading Arab League agencies. Foreign ministers of the 22-member Arab League met in Doha yesterday to draft the agenda. They also discussed the economic and social problems the Arab world faces, including promoting the development of the Greater Arab Free Trade Area, guaranteeing the food safety of Arab countries, and improving the status of women. Prime Minister Abdullah briefed Senate members on 2 weeks of consultations he had with MPs, political forces and civil society institutions in his bid to form a new government. He told Senate President Tahir al-Masri and members of the upper house that the dialogue was serious and sincere as it aimed to build consensus on the shape of the next cabinet and the prospect of bringing in lawmakers to take ministerial posts in line with the new parliamentary government system. He said he is not in a haste or is slow in naming the government lineup, expressing his conviction that the incoming government will be small in size and without MP ministers, but added that MPs can join the ministerial team at a later stage on the basis of merit and in a way to make the experience succeed, commenting on U.S. President Barack Obama's visit to Jordan at the weekend. Mansour said it sent a clear message of support for the kingdom's policies and its role in the region and the world. He said the U.S. Congress had endorsed Jordan's request for loan guarantees that will be passed to the House of Representatives, reflecting U.S. confidence in Jordan's economy. Commenting on monetary policy, Mansour said measures taken in the last few months, including the liberalization of fuel prices, had raised foreign currency reserves from $5 billion to $8 billion and also propped up confidence in the dinar. On energy, Mansour said a planned Jordanian-Iraqi oil pipeline extending between the southern Iraqi city of Basra and the port of Aqaba would ensure a steady flow of oil to the energy-poor kingdom. His Royal Highness Crown Prince Al-Hussein bin Abdullah, the Regent, attended a celebration at the University of Jordan marking the 45th anniversary of Al-Karama battle. The Regent unveiled a plaque commemorating the martyrs, which highlighted the sacrifices of the Jordanian armed forces in the battle. He listened to students on the portrait, which glorified the names of fallen soldiers that were carved on a copper board. Prince Al-Hussein also viewed a paintings exhibition by the students depicting the heroism of Jordanian servicemen. The ceremony included poetry readings and patriotic songs and folklore performances by university students. Jordan denied it closed its border with Syria. State Minister for Media Affairs Samih Al-Maita said the kingdom is closely following up developments in Syria and will take its decisions in line with its national interest. The Syrian refugee population in Jordan is growing by the hour, pushing the total number towards the 500,000 point. More than 1,100 Syrian refugees, many of them children, women and elderly people, as well as injured people, had crossed into the kingdom in the past 24 hours. An official armed forces source said border guard units had escorted the refugees and evacuated them to a designated point where they received immediate aid or medical help. The displaced Syrians were later transferred to the Zaatari refugee camp. A senior Russian diplomat said his country, along with China, wanted to send a team of experts to take part in a UN investigation into charges that chemical arms were used in Syria on March 19th. Syrian rebels fired mortar rounds into central Damascus, killing at least 2 people and drawing a fierce army response as bombardments shook the heart of the Syrian capital, Damascus. President Bashar al-Assad's forces have lost swathes of territory to rebels in the north and east. Luay Balkar has more.
The bloodshed in Syria rages and the world stands idle. Damascus came under heavy bombardment with shells and explosions hitting the Damascus countryside. Thick smoke also rose in Umayyad Square in the heart of the capital. State radio and television and the opera house are located in the square. In Homs, Syria's 3rd largest city, artillery, tanks and airstrikes pounded the city as local residents screamed for losing loved ones. Many people had been killed in the attack and the bodies were wrapped and ready to bury. Elsewhere, the rebels were celebrating a recent defeat of government forces in the town of Sahim. The United Nations said it will move about half of 100 foreign staff members out of Syria after a number of mortar shells fell near the hotel in Damascus, damaging the building and a UN vehicle. A UN official told the Security Council the situation continued to worsen and urged both sides to end the violence.
The continuing pursuit of a military victory by both sides and their reckless disregard for civilian lives and their protection are of deep concern for the United Nations. Impunity is widespread, human suffering and destruction are pervasive.
Meanwhile, the man who established and once commanded the rebel Free Syrian Army in 2011 has been badly wounded and lost a leg by an explosion caused by a bomb placed beneath his car in Deir al-Zur province. Colonel Riyad al-Assad, who was one of the first senior officers to defect from the Syrian army to fight for the overthrow of President Bashar al-Assad, was rushed to a hospital and is currently being treated in Turkey. During his first visit to Syria since his election, Provisional Syrian Prime Minister Ghassan Hito visited people and businesses in rebel-controlled Aleppo to begin restoring services to the areas. Meanwhile, the resignation of Mu'adh al-Khatib, the head of Syria's main opposition, could make the West more cautious in supporting the revolt. Al-Khatib was seen as a moderate against the rising influence of jihadist forces. Lu'ay Balqar for the news at 10.
Over to Israel. Israel announced it will restart regular monthly tax transfers to the Palestinian Authority. The restoration of vital funding came days after US President Barack Obama called for confidence-building steps towards peace. Israel began withholding the hundreds of millions of tax money last November after Palestinians secured non-member observer state status at the United Nations. The cut-off was a blow to the Palestinian Authority, which urgently needed the cash to pay public sector salaries at a time of growing financial strain. The announcement comes on the day Israel sealed off the occupied West Bank for a Jewish holiday. Alia Touqan has the story.
Israel stepped up security ahead of the Jewish festival of Passover, which began at sunset. Checkpoints in the occupied West Bank were closed to pedestrians, and all vehicles were subject to stringent checks. Queues of traffic built up at crossings near Bethlehem and Ramallah as Israeli troops checked all vehicles entering the Jerusalem area. Most Palestinians who have permission to work in Israel need to cross the checkpoint on foot. For Ahmad Janazra, a resident of Al-Arrub refugee camp near Hebron, crossing the checkpoint from the West Bank in Bethlehem to Jerusalem is a daily necessity. It can take him up to 2 hours to cross the border, which he does early to avoid the queues. But he says today's closure means he cannot work.
Today I came here and I was surprised that there is a closure, and that makes me suffer because this week I hardly worked, so I didn't earn very much.
Passover is a week-long holiday, with the main celebration taking place from sunset today until sunset tomorrow. Also on the eve of the holiday, Jewish extremists and settlers stormed the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound in occupied East Jerusalem under Israeli police escort. Palestinian settlers entered from the flashpoint Bab al-Magharbi adjacent to the Western Wall at a time foreign tourists were allowed in and performed prayers. Palestinian religious students inside the compound have been on high alert for fear settlers would break into Islam's third holiest shrine. The tension has been ratcheted up by tight security Israel has imposed in occupied Jerusalem and the West Bank. Alia Touqan for the news at 10.
The United Nations Special Coordinator of the Middle East peace process, Robert Serry, called for fresh diplomatic efforts between Israel and the Palestinians. He also told the UN Security Council during a monthly meeting on the Middle East that the visit by President Barack Obama to the region last week marks an important opportunity towards a two-state solution.
The visit by President Obama to the region last week marks an important opportunity to reinvigorate efforts towards a two-state solution. President Obama met with leaders on both sides. He also visited His Majesty King Abdullah of Jordan, who has been central to recent dialogue initiatives. In a direct follow-up to the visit, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry met with President Abbas in Amman and returned to Jerusalem to meet with Prime Minister Netanyahu. The United Nations welcomes continued U.S. commitment to the peace process, and we appreciate President Obama's strong reaffirmation of the two-state solution as necessary, just, and possible in his speech on 21 March, where he called for an independent, viable Palestine while emphasizing Israelis' right to insist upon their security.
In Cyprus, global equity markets and oil prices rose after Cyprus agreed to a painful bailout that will avert a collapse of its banking system and keep the country within the Eurozone. Cypriot policymakers reached an 11th-hour deal with the European Union, the European Central Bank and the International Monetary Fund to shut down its second largest bank in return for 10 billion euros. We get more in this report.
Eurozone ministers reached an 11th-hour deal with Cyprus on a 10 billion euro bailout plan to spare the country from financial meltdown. Eurogroup Chairman Jeroen Dijsselbloem.
The program will be based on ambitious measures in areas of fiscal consolidation, structural reforms and privatization. The authorities will also take decisive action to safeguard the stability of the financial sector, including bank resolution and deep restructuring measures concerning the two largest banks.
Those ambitious measures include the closure of the Popular Bank of Cyprus, also known as Laiki, and the transfer of deposits below 100,000 euros to the Bank of Cyprus. Deposits above 100,000 euros will be frozen and used to resolve debts. And, of course, Cyprus will remain a part of the European Union. Cypriot Finance Minister Vassos Siarli.
Essentially, it's not that we won a battle, but we really have avoided a disastrous exit from the Eurozone.
The news played well in Asia, where markets opened up on the news. The Nikkei rebounded after a sharp fall last week. The South Korean won also up. And in China, the yuan traded at 6.2 per dollar, its highest level ever, on news that the crisis had been averted.
The leader of rebels in Central African Republic has pledged to name a power-sharing government to defuse international criticism of a coup. The seizure of power by Seleka rebels has left 13 South African soldiers dead and plunged the country into chaos. France, meanwhile, sent an additional 300 troops to Central African Republic to ensure the security of French citizens and diplomatic installations in the capital, Bangui, and help secure the airport. Paris has requested an urgent meeting of the UN Security Council to discuss a solution to the crisis in the landlocked former French colony. The rebels have seized the riverside capital in fierce fighting, forcing President Francois Bozize to flee. Over to Paris. The engagement ring given by Napoleon Bonaparte to his future wife smashed its estimate to scoop almost 900,000 euros at an auction outside Paris. The sum was a world record for a historic ring, as auction house Ozone had originally valued the piece at between 10 to 15,000 euros. The modest dimensions of the diamond and sapphire ring was part of a collection of historical artifacts. Also under the hammer was a rare portrait of Napoleon's son at the age of 12. The canvas also surpassed its estimate by taking 435,000 euros. Well, number one Novak Djokovic shook off windy conditions to win 2 straight sets and move into the 4th round of the Sony Open at Miami. Djokovic posted a 6-2, 6-4 victory over India's Somdev Devarman and set up a clash with German Tommy Haas, who moved through to the 4th round for the first time since 2001. The top-seeded Serb took 28 of his 31 first serve points and faced just one break point in a match that lasted for 68 minutes. In the same tournament, Spanish third seed Ferrer punched his ticket to the 4th round with a 6-1, 7-5 win over 32nd seeded Italian Fabio Fognini. Ferrer will now face 13th seeded Nishikori.
2 sets to love. 6-1, 7-5.
Former world champion Valentino Rossi was fastest in MotoGP testing in Jerez, Spain, after another rain-affected session. Just behind him was Yamaha teammate and current world champion Jorge Lorenzo of Spain. Britain's Cal Crutchlow was 3rd quickest on another Yamaha, while fourth fastest was Spanish Honda's rider Dani Pedrosa. It was the first time that Rossi had topped a MotoGP session since the first practice for last year's British Grand Prix at Silverstone. Now over to the weather. A relatively cold night with moderate winds. A further rise in temperatures is expected for tomorrow to become 6 to 7 degrees above seasonal average. Therefore, it will be dry and dusty with gusty winds. The Gulf of Aqaba should expect a pleasant night and a relatively hot day tomorrow with moderate to brisk winds and slightly choppy seas. Next are the lows and highs for tonight and tomorrow. Now, a reminder of our top stories. His Majesty the King heads for an Arab summit in Qatar after holding talks with Bahrain's monarch. The King says in an interview that Pan-Arab cooperation needs to be bolstered to face challenges facing the Arab world. And the Prime Minister-designate puts the Senate up to date on his attempt to form a cabinet and the government's course of action. And with that, we come to the end of this edition of the news. I'm Rad Laptouche. Thank you for watching and have a good night.